Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. There's a moment most of us know. We've experienced it, even if we've never had language for it. Someone says something to you, maybe they give you a look, it's just a comment, a request, and something internally flinches. And in that same second, before you've even really registered it, you're already deciding not to say anything. You smile, you nod, you let it go. Other times, it's not that subconscious. You notice the internal flinch. You sit on it while you smile outwardly. You nod. You still don't say anything, but you're more aware of it. Whatever that moment looks like, it has a name. Two names, actually. The first is self-abandonment. Self-abandonment is the pattern, the long-running habit of leaving yourself in order to stay connected to someone else. Not literally leaving the room, but leaving you, your reaction, your thoughts, your beliefs, your honest read of what just happened. The second concept is self-betrayal. This is the smaller cousin of the first one. If self-abandonment is the overall pattern, self-betrayal is what happens every single time you enact the pattern. It's the individual moment or the specific instance where you know what's true for you and you choose not to honor it. I touched on both of these terms in the last episode on the authentic self. I mentioned them almost in passing in that episode because at the time they felt fairly self-explanatory. Concepts that mostly explain themselves when you hear them. But after that episode, as I was planning what to record next, I realized that these two concepts probably deserve their own episode, not just a footnote, and not to just assume that you understand what those concepts are, but to actually give a whole episode devoted to those two concepts. Because I think they can be understood when you hear them. And I also think there's some nuance when we start to really look at the two concepts. One of those nuances is I wouldn't necessarily say that not speaking up or not saying what you wanted to say, not saying what you believe, isn't automatically self-abandonment. This idea can get twisted into something that it isn't. We don't have to say every thought that crosses our mind. We don't always have to disagree. Sometimes you might weigh a moment and genuinely decide this doesn't need to be said right now. And that's not necessarily a self-betrayal. That's using judgment. It might even be wisdom. The difference isn't whether or not you speak up. The difference is why you did or did not. If your silence came from a real read of the moment, and you thought to yourself, either the timing isn't right, or this isn't the hill I need to die on, or this doesn't matter enough to me to really engage in a back and forth. Or maybe you just tangentially know the person and it's not really worth it to get into a conversation about what they think and what you think. All of those moments would be a choice. But if your silence came from somewhere older, a belief that you're not lovable if you're fully seen, or that you don't matter enough to bring it up, that you're too much, that it's safer to stay small, or that if the person really knows you, they wouldn't accept you. That's not just a choice. That's the pattern of self-abandonment making the decision for you. Timing matters too. Not every moment is the right moment. And part of honoring yourself is learning to tell the difference between waiting because it's wise and waiting because you're self-silencing. A few questions that can help sort that out is to ask yourself, is this reaction still true in an hour? Or is it just heat that'll pass? Another question would be, is there a version of this conversation where the other person can actually hear it? And is that version right now? Or would that just collide with what's happening in the moment? And then the last question, am I choosing to wait, or am I finding a reason to self-silence? If the moment passes, if you read it wrong, or you weren't ready, you hadn't articulated your thoughts yet, or you just didn't catch yourself in time, that's also not the end of the opportunity. One of the things I frequently say to clients is, you can always circle back. Whether that's later that evening, the next day, a week from now, you can go back to the moment and say, I've been thinking about our conversation, and there's something I didn't say that I want to add. Speaking up late is still speaking up, and it still honors you. It still counts. One more thing that I think it's important to name before we get further into this episode is that success is never about whether the other person hears you, agrees with you, or changes anything because of what you said. That would be putting your own integrity into someone else's hands. Success is you using your voice. It's you honoring what's true for you. Success is the act itself, not what it produces in the other person. But there's also a trap hiding inside that idea too. Sometimes you do speak up. You regulate, you find your footing, you go back and try to clarify what you meant, or what you were feeling, or what you needed said. And it doesn't land the way you hoped. I often will say, we as human beings are much more likely to miscommunicate than we are to get it right the first time. So the other person doesn't quite get there with you. And in that moment, it can be tempting to think, well, I tried, and then just give up because it didn't work. I think that's another area where self-betrayal happens. Not just in staying silent, but in giving up too soon. One attempt isn't the ceiling. If something is still unresolved in you after you've spoken, that's information, not a stop sign. Honoring yourself doesn't end at the first try. Sometimes it means going back again. I've had my own version of self-betrayal. It often came in the form of self-silencing. For years, I'd hear something that I disagreed with, internally, quietly, and I'd say nothing. I'd sit in it, and I'd just let the moment pass. Other times, I would speak up. I'd say what I thought, or I'd offer my opinion, or I'd offer my perspective. And then I could just feel it didn't really land well, or it wasn't well received. Over time, I started asking myself a question in those moments, one that I sometimes still ask myself today. When I notice myself in that moment, I ask myself, will I regret not saying something right now? will I look back on this later and wish I had spoken up? And then I try to check in with my body and feel how that will feel when I'm looking back at this moment. And I was silent. And then I ask myself, or is this just actually not worth the pushback? Or is this actually just not a fight I want to fight? Or it's not something I want to get into and spend energy on? The answer to the question doesn't always land on speak up. Sometimes the honest answer is no, this just isn't worth it. Or this doesn't need my voice today. Or I just don't have the bandwidth right now. And that's fine. I think that's the judgment call we just talked about. But other times, the answer is yes. And I can feel it in my body. A small, clear pull that says, you're going to think about this later if you let it go now and say nothing. Those questions have become a kind of internal check-in for me. There's not a rule in the question. There's not, yes, you always should speak up. It's just a way of putting the decision in my own hands instead of letting the pattern that developed of self-silencing make the call for me without even noticing that the pattern had made the decision. As we've talked about in so many episodes, none of this starts as a flaw. It starts as a strategy, a smart one, for a small child with no other options. Gabor Mate has a way of framing this that I keep coming back to. He says, a child is born with two needs. The first is attachment. Attachment means to have contact, connection, and love. Being loved and being able to love back. He says every mammal needs this to survive. He points out it's even true for baby birds. But humans need it most of all because we're dependent longer than almost any other creature on Earth. And because throughout our lifetime, we need groups, tribes, families, societies, that attachment need doesn't shrink once childhood ends. It stays an enormous need for as long as we live. The second need, Mate says, is authenticity. Knowing what you feel, being in touch with your body, being able to express who you actually are in your relationships and in what you do with your life. He frames this authenticity as a survival need too, not a luxury and not self-indulgence. He says somewhere back in our evolutionary history, a person who'd lost touch with their own gut feeling, their own body's signals, didn't last long out in the wild. Reading yourself accurately was as much a survival skill as reading a threat. Here's the problem. These two needs, attachment and authenticity, don't always point the same direction. Sometimes staying attached to the people who keep you alive means editing the very authenticity that's supposed to keep you alive too. And when a child has to choose, they choose attachment every time over authenticity. Because a child without connection doesn't survive long enough for authenticity to matter. So the self gets quietly set aside, not abandoned all at once, but shaved down piece by piece, wherever it threatens the bond. It goes further. He connects this exact split to addiction. Addiction, in his view, is an attempt to solve a problem. He says the real question isn't just what happened 20 or 30 years ago. It's how that old rupture is still showing up right now in the present. The task isn't just excavating the past, it's recognizing its fingerprints in the current moment and finding a way through them. The way through, he says, is reconnection. Restoring the relationship with your own body, your own emotions, the parts of yourself that went quiet for a long time. And he asks a simple question about what recovery even means. To recover something, he says, is to find it again. That's the birth of the pattern we're talking about today. Self-abandonment isn't a character defect. It's an old script built by a much younger version of you in a context where it worked. It got you love, or at least it got you less conflict. It kept the attachment intact at the cost of the authenticity underneath it. The problem isn't that the strategy was wrong back then. The problem is that it's still running the show now, decades later, in relationships where the actual risk it was built for isn't even present anymore, or doesn't have to be. This is part of why insight alone doesn't lead to change. Understanding the what and the where matters. It's not nothing to finally have language for a pattern you've lived inside for decades. But understanding isn't the same as change. The pattern didn't get installed in your thinking. It got installed in your body, in what felt safe and what didn't, often long before you had words for either. And that means the change has to happen there too. Not just knowing the story differently, but experiencing yourself differently. Feeling something land in a new way, not just naming it correctly. I have a client I work with who, on his hardest days, will text me, usually just one line. I'm tired of understanding what I need to do. And almost every time, it isn't the understanding that's actually worn him out. It's the gap between what he now understands and what he's still feeling. The old material that hasn't caught up to the insight yet. Whatever specific detail or storyline is showing up in that week, I remind him of that gap. And I let him know genuinely how hard this kind of change is. Because it is. Knowing isn't the hardest part. Living differently in a body that still remembers the old way is the hard part. But there's another thing that I see when I get that text from him. I see a shift. He grew up not having anybody to express it's a hard day to. In his adult relationships, if he expressed that, it went unheard, unaddressed. So the feelings he had, the exhaustion, being worn out, often stayed where it always stayed. Unspoken, managed alone. Him texting me, telling me he's tired, he's exhausted, naming what's coming up, I don't see that as the old pattern showing up. Actually, I see the opposite. That's him expressing something he couldn't say before, or he decided it wasn't worth it. And to some degree, he didn't understand it. The content of the text is exhaustion. But the fact that he sends the text is progress. He's doing something different. And he gets somebody who meets that, hears it, and engages with it. The strategy is the same across almost everyone who lives this pattern. Edit yourself, keep the bond. But the belief underneath it, the specific story that gets installed, that part varies. And I think it's worth naming a few of the common ones, because until a belief has a name, it's really hard to catch in the moment. One of the common beliefs is, I'm not lovable. This one says the real you, unfiltered, isn't enough to be loved. So instead, you offer a curated version and hope no one notices the edit. That often looks like being easy, going with the flow, being agreeable, the friend who never has a preference about where to eat. Another belief is, I don't matter. This belief doesn't even fight for airtime. It assumes from the start that your reaction, your preference, your need isn't significant enough to bring it into the room. It can look like apologizing for taking up space that you're fully entitled to take. Another belief is, it's safer to stay small. This one isn't about being unlovable. It's more about safety. Somewhere, being noticed, being seen clearly, got associated with danger. So invisibility becomes the strategy. It can look like real accomplishment paired with real discomfort every time someone points it out. Another belief that's the mirror image of staying small is, I'm too much. This one says your intensity, your feelings, your needs are a burden to whoever's near you. So you dial yourself down before anyone has to carry the weight of the real version. It often looks like apologizing for crying, for caring, for having any reaction at all. And then the last one that I think is pretty common is, if they really knew me, they wouldn't accept me. This might be the most common thread running under all of the other beliefs. The fear that the full picture, not the edited one, is the thing that drives people away. It looks like closeness, but with walls in place. You can be real, but only up to a certain point. So it starts with different beliefs, but it's the same trade-off. Every belief ends in the same place. Silence instead of truth. Smallness instead of the whole self. And an edited version of you. What makes the pattern so hard to catch is it rarely announces itself with a crisis. Nobody wakes up one day having abandoned themselves. It's not a collapse all at once. It's more like an erosion. So gradual that by the time you notice it, you've usually forgotten there was ever a version of you that didn't feel this way. It shows up as a kind of resentment that you can't quite trace to a source. Not anger at any one person or any one moment, but a slow simmer underneath things. Present so consistently that you've stopped registering. It shows up as exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch. You rest and you wake up just as tired. Because the thing that's wearing you down isn't physical to begin with. It shows up as a creeping sense of being a stranger to yourself. Going through a life that looks from the outside like it's yours, while some part of you quietly wonders whose choices you've actually been making. And it shows up, maybe most disorienting of all, as not knowing the answer to simple questions anymore. Someone asks you what you want for dinner, what you're thinking about, what you actually believe. And there's a beat of real static before anything comes, if anything comes. Because the muscle that used to answer that question from the inside hasn't been used in a very long time. None of these may look like self-abandonment on the surface. They can look like burnout. It can seem like a personality, or it can feel just like being tired. That's usually why the pattern survives as long as it does. It's very good at disguising its own damage as something else. A client of mine sat with this exact thing a few weeks ago. One evening, a couple weeks ago, he was talking with his wife, and at some point he shared a memory, something from early in their something from early in their marriage. He thought he told it fondly, the way you tell a story about someone you love. He wasn't trying to be unkind. There was no edge to it, at least not from where he was standing. But somewhere in how he told it, something landed wrong for her. And his wife said one word back to him: ouch. He tried to clarify what he meant. That didn't seem to land. He gave it some time, tried to regulate, and went back to his wife and tried to explain what he'd actually meant. She heard him. She told him she understood what he was trying to say, but she also told him it hurt and that she needed to sit with it, to process it. By the time he brought it to our session, some time had passed. He told me he felt regulated, more settled than he had been the night it happened. He said, I think she's also more regulated. And he said what a lot of people would say in that spot: I know it's best to just move forward and leave it where it is. But as he and I talked in the session, something surfaced. At one point, when he would say, I know I just need to move forward, leave it where it is and move forward. But he motioned to his own gut, not with a name, just a sound like, something still there for him. He couldn't fully name it, but it was there. I asked him some questions. At one point, I offered a guess that maybe what he'd shared had landed on something older in her, some insecurity that predated him entirely. Now, neither of us can be sure of this. That part stayed unclear in our session because she wasn't present, and it didn't need to be resolved for what came next. As we were talking, he kept circling back to that same sentence: I know it's best to just move on. When we slowed what was happening down enough, he said, what came up in that moment when she said, ouch, was, if she really knows me, all of me, she won't accept me. I asked him, is that feeling in your gut the one that shows up right after you say, I know it's best to let it go? Is that self-abandonment? Does it feel like you're betraying yourself in that moment? He didn't really hesitate. I think actually he snapped and said, yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. And I know it so well. His story isn't unusual. It's what this looks like in a functioning, loving marriage between two people who are getting much better at repair. Self-abandonment doesn't need a crisis to show up. It just needs a moment where honesty feels riskier than silence. We didn't leave it right there in the session. He's a pretty articulate person, and he's been getting more insightful as he continues to do work. I told him, I don't know whether there's more to clarify with your wife, or whether this was less about her and more about circling back to the belief that had surfaced with her response and to this feeling sitting in his gut. He might find that there's more to clarify in a way that changes or gives deeper understanding for how it landed for her. Or it could be that what came up for her in that moment might be something she needs to process on her own terms, in her own time with her therapist. Not something he can just clarify his way out of. And maybe it's not even his to fix. But either way, he needed to address the gut feeling itself. The one that showed up the moment he said, I know it's best to just move on. That part wasn't optional. Regardless of what happened with his spouse, and regardless of what she does with what came up for her, he has to honor that feeling, the self-betrayal of letting it go. When clients say things like, ugh, or they motion with their hands about a feeling, usually that's information arriving in a form that comes before they have words for it. Long before we can name what we feel, the body usually already is feeling it. And it tends to speak in the same handful of phrases. My heart dropped, felt like a punch in the gut, knocked the wind out of me, even just ugh itself. None of these are precise, and they don't really explain anything. I think of them as the body's first draft. It's a signal arriving before your mind has built the sentence that would make sense of it. And it is worth paying attention to, because self-abandonment is quiet by design. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a decision in the moment. It feels calm, like moving on, being the reasonable one. The mind can be very good at narrating that as maturity. The body is not so easily fooled. It holds the residue, a tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a kind of low static that doesn't go away just because you've decided the conversation is over. And sometimes that's the only signal you get. Not a thought that says, I just betrayed myself. Just a feeling in the body with no name. A dropped heart, a gut punch, a weight sitting somewhere it shouldn't be sitting if things were actually okay. But it's also tricky because the signal doesn't always get read correctly. It can show up, and instead of being recognized as unfinished self-betrayal, it gets a different label slapped on. Irritability, too sensitive, free-floating anxiety. All of those labels can be accurate on their own terms. But sometimes what's actually happening is this exact thing. Something in you knows it's still owed a return trip. There's something here you have to circle back to, and it's making itself known the only way it can, since you haven't given it words yet. Learning to catch self-abandonment in real time means learning to trust that signal before building a story that explains it away. You don't need the full picture to know something's still there. You just need to notice you're feeling it, you're carrying it, and get curious about what it's pointing to. instead of talking yourself out of it. So what do you actually do with it? Not everything all at once, right there in that moment. The body's signal isn't a demand to speak immediately. It's closer to a flag on the play or a whistle blown during the game. It doesn't tell you what happened or who's at fault. It just says, stop. Something here needs to be reviewed before we can determine the call and settle it. Now, that's not exactly how it works. Body and mind don't run on rule books and referees, but it's close enough that I think the imagery is useful. The flag doesn't go away until we come back and look at it, review it, until we understand what we need to do. Regulating isn't complicated, even if it isn't easy. It can be as plain as noticing your breath has gone shallow and slowing it down on purpose. Naming silently what you're feeling instead of what you think you should be feeling. Waiting until your body isn't bracing anymore before you decide anything about what happens next. None of this requires a class or a technique, but it does require practice, and a lot of it. My client that I just referenced had done part of this. He'd regulated enough to go back to his wife once and tried to clarify what he meant. That helped some. She told him, I get what you're saying. So whether she fully did, neither me or my client could fully know. What we could know was what was still sitting in him afterward. The ugh hadn't gone anywhere. One pass at it had softened the moment, but I don't know that we could say it was finished. That's the trap from earlier, showing up in real time. One attempt isn't always enough. He was ready to call it done, but not because it actually felt resolved in him, but because something happened. He made her feel bad. He tried to clarify it. It didn't really work, so it had to be enough. What I encouraged him toward wasn't necessarily a new step. It was going back again, once he was steady enough to do it, without needing a particular response from her. Not to relitigate. I told him, I don't even know if you need to get into the context of what you shared. I don't know if that's what needs to be clarified. Maybe it's clarifying what came up for you, the belief underneath it, what your brain is telling you to just move on, and saying, that feels like a self-betrayal. And so I just needed to speak to it, just to finish what was still unfinished in him. To say, there's more here than I said the first time. To say, there's more here than I originally said. And I want to say it, not because I need you to agree, not because you made me feel this way, but just because I need to not carry it silently. That's honoring yourself. That's really the whole shape of honoring yourself. Feel it, regulate it, return to it, and return again if the first return didn't finish the job. If you skip the feeling, or you stop after one pass at returning, that can still feel like you're abandoning yourself all over again. This is what differentiation looks like in practice. It's not getting distant from your partner, and it's not independence from the people you love, but the ability to stay connected to someone while still staying connected to yourself. Not choosing between the relationship and your truth, but holding both at once and not letting one always be the cost of the other. That's what I encourage my client toward. Not just move on, and not a single conversation that can be treated as the finish line. Just keep finishing the process. Speak to what's true in you in a way that honors who you are, regardless of what happens next for her. His job was never to control what she did with what he shared. His job now was to stop abandoning himself in the space where she couldn't see it happening. Years ago, my kids were in elementary school, and one of my daughters had a teacher who had a saying she used with the whole class. You get what you get, and you don't throw a fit. My daughter brought that phrase home with her the way kids do, and I heard it throughout that school year. One evening, I'd made dinner, set the table, and I was calling everyone in for dinner. We had a set of colored cups from IKEA. The package of 4, 1 each color. I've seen them in different colors, but we had blue, green, yellow, and pink. One of my daughters walked in, saw where she was going to sit, and then she had the yellow cup. She said, "Oh, I don't want the yellow cup." Her sisters, as you can probably predict, weren't offering to trade. She looked at me to fix it. And without really thinking about it, I just reached for the phrase that I'd heard floating around our house all year. And I said, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. One of my other daughters, sitting at the table, looked right at me and said, "Mom, you don't even believe that. You've never told us to just accept something we don't like. If we don't like something, you've always told us to do something about it." She was right. I didn't necessarily believe that. And I hadn't taught him that. I can understand why an elementary school teacher might need a phrase like that for a classroom full of 26 kids. A classroom has to run on something more efficient than case-by-case negotiation. And in a sense, I do believe something like it, in a bigger sense. I do believe that our planet is too small for everyone to get their way all the time. But that's also not what I had taught my own daughters at that age in our house. What I'd taught them was to do something about it when they didn't like how things were. So I took a pause. I said, okay, that's true. I don't believe that. And I haven't taught you that. And I looked at the daughter who didn't want the yellow cup and I said, but for dinner tonight, can you just use the yellow cup? I wasn't asking her to abandon herself. I think not every moment is the moment to fully fix something. But I also didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I knew I had to go to IKEA. And I picked up another 4-pack of cups, another pack of 4 cups, so that everybody could have the color they actually wanted every night. Or at least nobody had to have the 2 yellow cups. Problem solved, right? Not by asking any of them to accept less, but by going back and finishing what I'd started at the table. We've talked about the yellow cup since then. Sometimes you draw the yellow cup, and you know what? It's a yellow cup. Who you are isn't writing on that. The water in the yellow cup tastes the same as the water in the green cup. That's not self-abandonment. But also, what I said didn't align with what I had been teaching or what I believed. Self-abandonment doesn't always look like a crisis or years of silence. Sometimes it looks like a phrase you didn't mean, said to move the moment forward. And sometimes the whole practice of honoring yourself is accepting it, saying so out loud, and then actually going back to fix what you can. You won't catch every moment. I didn't catch that one until my daughter caught it for me. But when she pointed it out, I accepted the feedback. She was right. I don't believe that. And going back still counts. The relationship you're most responsible for keeping honest is the one with yourself. And that one, unlike most others, will always let you come back. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.